For this project, we're going to be using our lesson files from this folder here, Lesson 1, Part 6. So we'll be going into this in a second, but we're first going to go through and look at the import options in After Effects. So let me just switch across to After Effects. I'm going to create a brand new project, just File, New Project, and then we'll look at the different ways that we can import using the project window here. So the first option I have is to go to File and down to Import. Now this presents me with three different options. I have the ability to import a single file, multiple files, or a placeholder. Now I'll get onto these separately. If I go into the file import, this will allow me to import a single file at one time, but depending on different operating systems, I can use this to also select multiple files. So these two are very, very similar. Multiple files will also allow me to pick up multiple files as well as individual files, so I'll try and explain those as I go along. You can see that I also have a keyboard shortcut which is Command-I or Control-I on the PC, so that's another quick way to invoke the file import dialog box. The third way to do this is one that I very much prefer, which is to come back over to my project window and simply double click. Now if I do that, you see it now invokes our import file dialog box which we can work in. Another way, just before we go into that, I'm just going to cancel that out. Again, inside the project window, I can hold down the Control key on the Mac and click, or right-click on the PC, and I access exactly the same options, as well as a couple of extra ones here for new composition or new folder. So I can go here and select Import File, again, multiple or placeholders, and I can even choose the Import Recent Footage option, which we saw in the menu a second ago. So I'm now going to go into Import, choose File, and bring up the dialog box. So here we are with our source files for Lesson 6. And before I even go in and actually select any files manually, let's say I have some footage somewhere on my hard drive and I'm not sure of the location of it, maybe it's on a server somewhere, I can actually tell After Effects to search for it for us. So I can just come down here and click Find. And what I'm going to do is key in either the name of a specific file I'm looking for or part of the name, just in case there's many files with that particular naming version. So I'm just going to type in AB and space because I have some Artbeats clips on my hard drive which have been given a prefix of AB and then a space and then the rest of the actual clip name. And if I hit OK, you'll see that After Effects now searches through the hard drive and is locating those files with that prefix. Now unfortunately this is a Mac only feature. Windows users will not have access to a Find File option. If I come down here and hit Find again, it will go through the current folder and show me all the files with AB. And then it will actually go through and continue looking through the hard drive to find other clips beginning with that name. So this is a really easy way to locate any of the files that you might be looking for. Now, whilst we're on the subject of QuickTime here, let's say you're in the process of setting up an After Effects file and you're not entirely set up yet with regards to the clips that you're going to be using. I showed you something briefly earlier which was called a placeholder. We saw it in the File menu when I went to Import. This is particularly handy when we're dealing with footage that we don't already have, so I'm actually going to cancel out of this dialog box and show you exactly what a placeholder will do. If I go to the File menu, I can come down and choose Import Placeholder, or even quicker was obviously in the project window itself, just Control-click on the Mac or right-click on the PC and come down to Import and choose Placeholder. Now what it does is it doesn't actually import something, it brings up a new dialog box asking me what I want to name my placeholder. So what I'm doing here is actually putting something in place that we can replace later with the actual footage. So I'm just going to name this 01, something simple like that. We can name it obviously later on. And I'm going to use it to maybe drop in a Photoshop file that someone might be working on. Now, it could be a movie, it could be anything that I need, but I'm just going to say a Photoshop file. The resolution that we're working at on these files is 720 by 540. I'm just going to say OK. And you'll see what it places in as a color bar graphic with our name in italics. So it's actually recognizing this is a placeholder graphic. We can then drop this into a composition and work around with keyframes and anything else that we need to apply to that layer, but we're not actually using the source footage itself. Now when the time comes to actually use the source footage, all we need to do is double click it and it brings up a new dialog box which you see is called Replace Footage File, and it's going to ask us to locate a new file with which to replace it. So I'm just going to go into my source files folder, take our stills folder here and just choose one of my Photoshop documents and say import. You'll see that the merge layer dialog box comes up. I'll explain this in just a second because this is all to do with Photoshop import. But when I click OK, you'll see that my placeholder layer has been replaced with a Photoshop graphic, and any compositions that were then using that placeholder will automatically be updated with those new pixel graphics ready to use. And what I want to do now is look at bringing in individual files and multiple files. And as you've already seen, we have a couple of options for doing that. So what I'm going to do is come into the project window, again, control click on the Mac or right click on the PC and go to import and just go straight forward to file or command I or control I to bring up the import dialog box. And again, from my source files, what I'm going to do is go into the movies folder, and here we have those Art Beats clips which I had a second ago. Now I mentioned that you can actually use multiple file import from this standard import dialog box, and that's a very simple process depending on your operating system. All I need to do is to use the command key on the Mac or the control key on the PC and select multiple files that I wish to import. Now I'm doing those separately. I could always come down to select one of these and just use the shift key, come all the way down and select the bottom one. It would highlight all 4 of these files and allow me to import them at the same time. Now once I click the import button, this dialog box will disappear and I will need to invoke it again to import more files. So what I'm going to do just in this instance is just select one of these movies and hit import. And then I'm going to come back over here to the project window and just go back and say import multiple files and show you the differences between these 2 dialog boxes. The import multiple files window looks identical, and for all intents and purposes it is, but what it allows me to do is, let's say I went in and chose the second movie in this section, and then I hit import by mistake and say, oh, I needed to actually do a multiple. What it will do is import that piece of footage and then reload the import multiple files window again, allowing me to go back and select the rest of the files which I wish to import. So now I can say, well, let's bring those last 2 in there, and again go down to import. Those will be added to my project window. Again, the multiple files dialog box comes up. All I'm going to do is now say done, and that will then cancel that, and I can now go back to working with other import options. Let's take a look now at sequences. Now this is something that's pretty special inside of After Effects. Control click again or right click and bring up the import file option. And through my source files, I'm going to come down to my movies, and I have a folder in here that's called Head and Shoulders TIFF. Now if I select that, you'll see that I have an option down here that says import folder. Now, let me click on it and allow it to work. It will actually create a folder inside my project window that actually contains every single one of those items. Now you see that there were 60 items in there. They're all individual frames of an animation. And if I drop down the twirly option here, you can see we can find every single one of those files. So this would allow me to work on them on an individual basis. Now the way that a sequence works is it actually takes each one of those frames and basically converts them into a movie. So it allows us to then scroll through the movie and see each individual frame, add effects, and add geometric changes in After Effects, instead of having to deal with, in this case, just 60 separate layers. Imagine if you have a sequence that has many multiple thousands of frames in. So again, I'm just going to go back to Import and File, come back to my Movies folder, again choose Head and Shoulders TIFF, but this time what I'm going to do is select the first frame in that animation. And if I selected import at this point, what it will do is just import that as an individual graphic. Okay, so it'll treat it almost as if it's a Photoshop document. It will ask me about alpha channels, and it's just going to bring in that one frame. What I want to do, though, is convert all of these files into a movie sequence, and that's exactly what this button down here does. It recognizes that this is a TIFF sequence. Let's say you had a Photoshop sequence or a JPEG sequence. This text would change to suit the type of sequence that you have. And all I'm going to do is turn on the TIFF sequence option and say import. You can see that the first option I get is it asks me about the alpha channel, because this movie has been rendered with alpha channels. So I have simple options, which I will explain a little bit more in detail when I get to my Photoshop files. I'm actually going to go through and just choose the straight unmatted option and say OK. Now you'll see what it's done. If I go back to my project window, it's imported an individual file, and it's actually saying here it's a TIFF sequence. To see it, all I do is double click on it, bring it up in my main window, and you can see here that the alpha channel was respected. We have a transparent background, which I can just come up here and turn off on the top right hand side. But the cool thing is that you'll see as I scroll through this now, I'm actually seeing the whole animation as one basic movie file. So it's taken all those 60 frames, placed them together in one sequence, so now it's easy for me to trim it, time stretch it, add effects, add keyframe changes, and basically animate all those 60 layers as if they are on one file. Now, importing a sequence can be done in 2 separate ways. I just showed you the basic import options of using import dialog and then choosing the 2 choices that you have. What I can do is actually go straight from the desktop. So you'll see over here on the right hand side I have my project files, and what I'm going to do is just go in and locate in my source files the same movie folder that we were just using, which is this Head and Shoulders TIFF. And I have 2 options as to how I can bring that in to After Effects. Let me just pull After Effects into the foreground. If I drag this folder straight across into the project window, you'll see what it does is it imports a TIFF sequence by default. So this is very, very quick. Instead of going through the file import dialog box, which we just did, this is a much faster way of doing it. However, if you did want to import a folder full of footage the same way we just did, go through the same process, but after you start dragging, hold down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows, and it will do exactly what we had a second ago. It will create a folder with every single one of those items stored separately inside as individual frames. You can see that you have two different ways there to bring in a sequence, one from the desktop and one by going to File Import itself. Now, one other thing that's worth pointing out is if we wanted to import a folder full of footage the same way that we could by going to File, Import, and choose File, and then select a whole folder full of footage, you might want to actually bring in a whole folder from the desktop in a very similar way to what we just did here, but this folder does contain all images which can be turned into a sequence, so that was fairly safe. What about if we come back a level here on my hard drive and try and import this whole movies folder? If I dragged that straight across here, it could confuse After Effects because it's looking for all file types to be very similar inside that folder and try and convert them into a sequence. So do remember, if you're going to drag a whole folder full of different types of movies, which might be graphics, it could be Illustrator files, it could also be QuickTime movies and sequence folders, make sure you do hold down that Option or the Alt key as you drag the folder in, and then After Effects will not get confused and it will import the whole folder as all the correct file types that are contained inside it. And you can see that as I now double click and open Movies 1-6, you can see we have the 4 QuickTimes in here, as well as the full TIFF sequence folder with 60 elements inside it, and my 2 interlacing sample movies at the same time. So that's definitely one of those things that you want to bear in mind when you're dragging folders of footage from the desktop of your computer straight into After Effects. Now, the next thing we're going to do is look at bringing in stills from programs like Photoshop and Illustrator, and I have a folder full of footage here for that. Before I do that, let me just go back into my After Effects project here and just do a little bit of tidy up. We've obviously got some excess files in here that we want to get rid of, so let me just remove some of these whole folders here. We do have an excess of footage, and we can also get rid of one of our sequences and probably this whole folder of footage here also. So that's now nice and tidy. Let's have a look at bringing in our stills. Now, if I come across to the stills folder here, we can see that we have a selection of Photoshop and Illustrator files. If I scroll down here, I have quite a few, and each one is going to react in a different way when we import it into After Effects. Now, the first one we're going to focus on is this one here called T3V Plasma Silhouette PSD. Now, we're going to import that the standard way by going into the project window and just double-clicking to bring up the File Import dialog box. And then what we can do is from that stills folder, just come down and choose the T3V Plasma Silhouette.psd. Now, I'm given a couple of options to start with. We're just going to keep it fairly standard. I'm just going to say I wish to import this as a footage item, and we're obviously not going to bring this in as a sequence, as you've seen us do already. And I'll just go ahead and hit the import button, and when I do, I get a dialog box that asks me what I want to do with the various layers inside my document, and also in After Effects 6 now, a new way of dealing with that. So I'll show you what I mean. The first thing I have is the ability to either merge the layers together, so it's kind of like using flatten image inside of Photoshop, or go ahead and choose any of the individual layers that I have here in the Photoshop file. As well as that, I can also choose this new option, Footage Dimensions, and whether it's set to layer size or document size. And we're going to try those out in just a short while so you can see the differences between them. But what I'm going to do is simply say layer size and choose Merge Layers at this point and go ahead and click OK. Now you'll see that the file has been imported. It comes in as a PSD file, and it says here that our file size is 720 by 540, and that's the size it was created inside of Photoshop. And I can always just double click and open that and check that everything is intact, and it is. There's no specific alpha channel in here. It's very much a layered file. So that's what happens when you import a Photoshop file as a piece of footage. Just merge all the layers down and you're left with one single layer. Now this doesn't mean that you can't keep the original selected like it is now, and go up to the Edit menu and say Edit Original. That's still available, not a problem. You can always bounce back and forth to Photoshop doing that. Very easy. Now, if we come back to the file, you'll notice, as we looked a second ago, the file size was 720 by 540. Yet when we imported, we used a new option that said bring in the file using layer size. So I know for a fact that in this Photoshop document, these white streaks that appear off the background of the logo are actually bigger than the default file size of 720 by 540. So effectively, they're being cropped off the outside. Now, even though I chose the new layer size option, I didn't get the option to have a larger file, and there's a reason for that. Basically, the background file size of my Photoshop document, the file setup, is 720 by 540, and that's what After Effects reads in. Now, the way that it works with layer size or comp size settings is very different when we import the multi-layered Photoshop file as a composition. I'm going to get onto that in a second because there's something I still want to cover regarding import like this, but I did want to point that out before we go any further. So I'm going to choose again to import. I'm going to select the one we've got and just delete it so we don't end up with multiple files in here. And once again, I'm going to double click to bring up the import dialog box. Once again, scroll down and choose the same file, T3V Plasma Silhouette, and go ahead and just click import. We are still importing this only as footage right now. And once again, just click import. And in the dialog box that comes up, and this time we're going to choose a different layer. So this time I'm going to choose T3V. This is the little logo itself, just the black logo in the center. And once again, I'm going to leave it set to layer size instead of document size. And document size is obviously 720 by 540. So if I choose layer size and say OK, you'll see just that individual layer comes in and its actual size is obviously less than 720 by 540. So After Effects 6 is now importing layers based on their specific size and not on the dimensions of the document, which is a great way to work. Now we can also try this out with a larger layer. Let's once again double click, go back and import exactly the same file, the Plasma Silhouette, as footage. And this time when it asks for a layer name, let's choose the streaks and of course say layer size. Go ahead and click OK. And we'll see the resulting file is much bigger. It's 968 by 769, and that's the size that I created it in Photoshop. So by importing the layers individually this way, I have the ability to bring them in at their full size, which would allow me to scroll them over a background video size and have room to play with. But the problem here is that we're only importing one layer at a time, and this is where we really then decide, do we want to bring in individual layers, or do we want to actually import the whole Photoshop file ready to animate as a composition? And that's what we'll do right now. So once again, let's just tidy up this window. I'm going to select, in fact, all these 3 Photoshop files. We don't need all of those for now. Just go ahead and hit delete. And once again, we're obviously asked with a multiple selection if we do need to remove them, if we're absolutely sure we're doing that. Let's go ahead and say OK. And just double click to bring in the same file again. Go down and choose Plasma Silhouette. But this time, where it says import file as footage, we can see that After Effects 6 now gives us an extra option. We previously only used to be able to say import as composition, and that brought in all the layers from the Photoshop document with every one cropped to 720 by 540, or the size of the file that you are currently working on. Now we have an option to say import composition as cropped layers also. So we'll do a quick test between these two. First off, let's go back to the old way of doing things and just choose a straightforward composition. Go ahead and click import, and what you'll see in your project window are now 2 files. We have an After Effects composition right here which has been created, and also a folder containing, if we drop that down, the 3 separate layers that make up our file. You can see them there in the preview at the top, the logo, the streaks, and the plasma. And also notice the size here, every single one is 720 by 540. It's been cropped to the original document size. So just to check it out, we can double click on the composition to open it in our main window, and we can see there is the file. And if we look in the timeline, you can see the 3 layers there already. So this is a great way to take Photoshop files into After Effects and get ready to animate them. We simply import them as a composition. But the downside to this, and again one of those features that has been updated, is the ability to bring in layers at their correct size. We brought everything in here set to composition, so every layer, even the streaks one in the background here, if I just select that and on screen move it around, you'll see the edges have been trimmed out. Despite the fact we know the layer is larger, it has been trimmed out. So we can now get around that by instead importing what's called cropped layers, and that will allow us to keep the original layer size. So what we'll do is come back to the project window, and I'll select both of those elements, the composition and its folder of contents, and just say delete and say OK, because we're going to go back and do it again. Once again, double click to import the same file. Go ahead and choose composition cropped layers this time, and not just a plain composition. And go ahead and click import, and we'll end up with exactly the same result. We actually have a composition here you can see is 720 by 540. It still retains the original document size, and we do have a folder in here containing those same 3 layers. But if we go ahead and double click to open up the composition, one thing that stands out is this little highlight edge you can see around the side here, and that represents a layer that is larger than the document size itself and is sitting in the background nicely cropped. So we still have the same 3 layers in here, but they have been brought in at their original size. If I select the T3V one, you'll see that the boundaries of this are not to the 720x540. It's the smaller size that we saw a while back. But very importantly, if I select the streaks layer here, we have this outer boundary that allows me to now move this around, and I have excess space which I can animate with and not worry about cropped edges of the file at 720 by 540. So it means you can work with layers that are oversized, you don't have to crop them down, and After Effects will retain that information whilst bringing the composition in as 720 by 540 and give you a little bit more flexibility. Now, talking of flexibility, there's a slight change here with the way that you would work with dragging footage from the desktop into After Effects, and we're going to give that a quick try with a layered Photoshop file. So once again, I'm going to select the two files that we have here in the project window, the composition and its contents in that folder. Just go ahead and say delete, OK, get rid of that. And then if we come across to our stills folder, this is the file we've been working on over here, the plasma silhouette. And what we'll do is, as we've done before, just drag this over into the AE window to bring up our dialog box for import. And obviously we have the settings we saw initially, the choose layer and also the footage dimensions still set to layer size or document size. The only thing we don't have an option for when we drag a file from the desktop to the project window is to import as either footage or composition. You'll see that's not an available option. Well, it is, but we have to set a preference for it. That's a very different way of working. So this is the way that you import footage from the desktop if you just simply want to bring in the Photoshop file and choose individual layers or merge the layers together. If you want to bring in a Photoshop file as a composition and drag it from the desktop, this is where we call up our preferences. So if we go ahead and click cancel out of there, we can go to the After Effects menu, choose our preferences and go down to the one that says import. And this will bring up the import preferences. And down at the bottom, there's one option that says default drag import as, and it's set to footage. So that means whenever we drag something from the desktop into the After Effects project window, it will by default use footage. And here we can say instead, bring it in as a composition by default. So if I just choose that quickly and go ahead and click OK, and once again come back to our plasma silhouette here and drag it back into AE, you can see that there's no dialog box that comes up. I just immediately get a brand new After Effects composition and our folder with the 3 layers in, just like we had before. Our project itself is 720 by 540, and if I go ahead and open that, you can see that my layers are all the original size. Let me just zoom down there a second. We can see the outer boundary here of the streaks layer. By default, it has used the cropped layers option, which is, in my view, the best way to bring in a layered Photoshop file because it will bring in those extra boundaries of larger layers. So that's pretty much the way that we set it in the preferences. Now, you might not want that always set. The chances are more often that you will drag files in as footage from the desktop. So what we should do really here is just go back into preferences briefly, back to import, and just reset that to footage from composition. Go ahead and click OK. Okay, let's have a bit of a tidy up again. Let's get rid of those last 2 files, because what we're going to do now is take a look at something very important when importing Photoshop files, which is how After Effects deals with alpha channels present inside those files. Now come back across to the stills folder and just scroll down a little way, and we'll see a file here that's called watercolorbackground.psd, and we can see from its little icon preview that it's a series of colors filling what looks like the whole 720 by 540 file size that we have from the document. And that is pretty much what is going on there. We do have a full layer. However, when we drag this into After Effects, we're going to see something very different. Let's drag it in, drop it in there, and we will see obviously the same settings we've had already. And I'm just going to go ahead and say, let's use merge layers and let's use document size just in case the overall watercolor background was slightly larger than the original. Go ahead and click OK. And you'll see in the preview that comes up, this is nothing like what we just saw on the desktop. We've actually got a black background here. File size is correct at 720 by 540, but we're not seeing what we originally intended. And even here, my little preview in After Effects shows me a full file. So why am I seeing a difference between the two of these? Well, the reason is there is an alpha channel inside this document in Photoshop. The way I can check it, what I'll do is just drag this piece of footage onto a new composition icon down here at the bottom of the project window, and we'll see this inside the main composition. So here I have just the one layer, and here I have our original watercolor with a black background. And obviously that's not a black background, it's actually transparent. If I come down here and click on the transparent background button in our composition window, we can see exactly that. So this information comes from an alpha channel that has been saved with this document. If I go ahead and turn off the transparency and come across here to our red, green, blue, and alpha channel buttons, I can click on there and there is the alpha channel. So there is an extra channel inside our Photoshop document which contains these white and these black pixels, and the black pixels are used to remove anything that's present in the R, G, and B channels when the file is composited in After Effects. So that is what's coming across, and by default it is removing that whole background. Now what we can do is double check this. If I come back to the project window for a second and select the watercolor background, I go to the edit menu and choose edit original, or hit Command E or Control E on the PC, that will launch this file over into Photoshop, And there we can see the original multicolored background. But if I just drag my channels palette in over here, we can see that I have the red, the green, the blue, and there is the same alpha channel, the one that After Effects is now using for transparency. So this is how the file was created. Now, just because it was made this way, it doesn't mean that that's the be-all and end-all and we can't do anything with that transparency when we take it into After Effects. Just wanted to point out that that's where it exists. We're going to play around with a couple of extra options here. So what I'll do is I'll jump back over into After Effects and go ahead and select both of those items and remove them. We don't need those because we're going to try a different file this time, which is going to be this one right here, the T3V Flowers and Grass. Now, if you just scroll up your window so you can see the preview, you can see it's got a green background, a couple of letters in there, and a blue number 3. So it's a finished logo, and this is exactly what I want to see. So what we'll do is the same as before. Let's just drag it over into our project window. And once again, we'll say let's merge all of the layers together, and we'll choose everything down at document size, so it's set to 720x40, and say OK. And what we'll see this time is very similar to what we had before. We've got the black background, which is obviously transparent. And let's just throw it into a composition so we can check it as we go along. We've pretty much replicated what we had before, but this time, this is not the required result. I did want to keep what I can see here as an original file. I wanted to keep that green grass background. So why did this happen? Well, obviously it happened for the same reasons. This file has an alpha channel in it, but instead of being one that someone specifically left there for a purpose, it may be that you used it for construction inside of Photoshop and forgot to remove it, and by default, After Effects is going to recognize that the alpha channel is there and perform a transparency function for you. So instead of going back out to Photoshop and having to remove the alpha channel and come back in, we can deactivate the alpha channel here inside of After Effects, and it's a very easy process to achieve that. All we do is we select the item right here in the project window, and we can choose two things. We can either go up to the File menu and come all the way down to Interpret Footage, and I have this initial option that says Main, and that will allow me to access the options we need. The second way to do it is to not worry about going to the menu to do that, and simply on the item itself here in the project window, just simply Control and click on the Mac or right-click on the PC, and we will bring up some options specific to this clip, one of which here is Interpret Footage and also Main. And obviously you can see the third way to do it is to hit Command F on the Mac or Control F on the PC. They will all access exactly the same dialog box. So go ahead and use any one of those methods. All we want to achieve is to get the main Interpret Footage dialog box up. And all we're going to concentrate on is this section right here at the top, which says Alpha, and this is how it deals with that alpha channel. So at the moment, it's using either a combination, sometimes pre-multiplied or straight. They both deal with alpha channels. What we want to do in this particular case is say, remove the alpha channel, so After Effects doesn't put transparency in. The way we do that is simply click Ignore, and that will remove any reference to the alpha channel, and transparency will be reset. So if I go all the way down to the bottom and hit OK, what we'll see now is the original layered file inside of our composition looking exactly like it did in Photoshop because we've removed that transparency channel. The one that we didn't require has been taken out of the equation. Okay, let's tidy up once again. Let's select both of these files in the project window, the composition and the layer we were just using, and remove those. Say OK. We're going to concentrate now on one more important thing about alpha channels. Now, this is more of a problem thing that you will come across when doing compositing. I'm going to show you a good way to get around it, and it's to do with something called pre-multiplying or pre-multiplication of layers. Inside our stills, we have a file over here called T3V logo pre-multiply. This is blue and yellow one. I want you to, if you can, just double-click that and open it in Photoshop and just check it out. We see here in the channels palette, obviously we have the red, the green, and the blue channels, and we do also have an alpha channel in here. So we can see that the center of the alpha channel is good and strong. It's white, so it's 100% opaque. Then it starts to fade out with grays, which will obviously give us varying levels of transparency, out to black in the corner, which will give us complete transparency. The thing is with this, when we go back to the RGB channel, there's also no layers in this document. What you see here is exactly what you've got. It's a one layered file where the yellow halo in the background has been merged onto the blue background. Now, if we were to import this into After Effects, I might want to separate the yellow halo from the blue background. And I can't specifically do that if I don't have access to the layers. But this is where we have control over what's called pre-multiplying, which is where the background color and the foreground elements have been blended together using an alpha channel. If we still have access to that alpha channel, we can use that to our advantage and remove some of this color overspill. Now, we can't see the overspill at this point. We need to do that in After Effects. So I'm going to close this down. Let's close down the previous one also. And I'm going to jump back across into After Effects, and we're going to import that T3V logo multiply and just drag that into the project window. And you'll see it comes in with no questions whatsoever. It knows it has an alpha channel. It's a very simple one. And also there's no layers, but you can see it has dropped out the background. based on the alpha channel information. And we can see here it's using what's called a straight alpha channel. That's the other option we saw in the alpha dialog box. It tells us there's one alpha channel. I'm going to use exactly what I see. It's a straight alpha. So let's do the same. Let's drag this into a new composition so we can see what's going on. And I'll probably just zoom up on this just a touch. And if I turn on my transparent background, we can see that obviously the black is transparent. It's not composited onto a black background. But here we can see the problem. The alpha channel that we have, which we can always double check by clicking right here, because of its soft gray levels, it's also giving us soft transparency through the background, which still contains blue. And you can see a blue halo here that we don't want. We want to keep the original yellow and have that just fade out to complete transparency. So we can put this on a different colored background. So we can get around that by simply calling up the interpret footage dialog box again and specifying a new mode. So just like we did before, let's go and select the Photoshop logo here in the project window. And once again, just control click on the Mac or right click on the PC. Go ahead and choose Interpret Footage and Main, and you'll see our options, same as we had before. This time it's using straight unmatted. It's just saying use the alpha channel information. But here we can say it's pre-multiplied, and at the moment it's just by default saying it's matted with a black color background. That's obviously not what is in the file. We need to specify the color that's underneath the yellow. That's obviously the blue. So I'm just going to click on the black swatch here and adjust the brightness of my colors all the way up here. And go ahead and pick a blue which is fairly close to the one that we have. It doesn't have to be exact. If you wanted it to be exact, obviously you could measure the RGB values in Photoshop and key in the same RGB values here. But go ahead and click OK. All right, and then go ahead and click OK again. And we'll see something very, very different. We've now taken the blue information that was underneath the yellow in here, and After Effects has removed that, basically like we had access to the original layers of our file, and blended the yellow color back in by simply removing the blue background. Now we're free to composite this onto any color background that we need and not worry about the fact that this file didn't come across with layers and was flattened. So the pre-multiply option is very, very important, especially when you get different formats of files from people and you don't have access to the layers. If you have alpha channel information, pre-multiply is a very powerful thing. So the final thing I want to point out about importing files from Photoshop is the type of layer effects and layer styles and things that you can create in Photoshop that can be imported into After Effects and edited afterwards. There are limitations. I'm going to show you just a few of them. So what I'll do is I'll quickly again tidy up my project window by removing those two files we were just working on, the file itself and the composition. And over in my stills folder here, I want you to open up this file. It's called metalsignbackdrop.psd. So go ahead and double click that to open it in Photoshop. And you'll see it's a multi-layered file. It has a couple of text layers in here. It's got some layers that are shape layers here. They've been created using the Bezier pen tool. And obviously some effects like bevel and emboss and drop shadow. I also have some guides in here as well that I have hidden currently, but we can get to those a little bit later. Now, that was just really to show you what's in this file so we can see what it looks like and what it's supposed to look like when we bring it into After Effects. One thing I do want to point out is the color settings from Photoshop. When you're working on an RGB file or a CMYK file inside of Photoshop, if you're using your correct color settings, you see the image in the color that it should be when it's reproduced, either on the web, on video, or for print with CMYK. After Effects doesn't have color settings specifically, so by default it's using what's called an Adobe RGB color space, which is just a generic way of previewing RGB files in every Adobe application, as long as every one is set to use the same settings. Well, because After Effects won't allow us to specify those settings, we can tell Photoshop to set this file to those Adobe RGB settings, so then when we switch from Photoshop to After Effects, we don't see massive color shifts between this graphic and the one that we place over in After Effects. And to do that, all we do is go to the Photoshop menu and go ahead and choose Color Settings. And we can see it's a massive dialog box. We don't need to focus on the whole thing. All I want to check is that my advanced mode is set on and that my working color space here is set to Adobe RGB. That just means that the graphic I view here inside of Photoshop will look exactly the same when I take it into After Effects, because After Effects is pretty much using this exact same profile. So just double check that on your preferences to avoid any color shifts. Okay, so that's outlined this document. What we're going to do now is go across into After Effects and bring it in. So let's come back to the After Effects project window. And because we're going to import as composition, I want you to double click and go back to that stills folder, which is right here, and choose the metal sign backdrop PSD right there. And make sure that we set it to composition. We don't necessarily need crop layers at this point. Just a composition will be fine. It doesn't matter what size the layers are, but obviously I want to make sure that I've got access to all the layers individually. Go ahead and click Import. And then from the project window, double click to open up the composition, and we'll see that it looks somewhat different to what we just saw in Photoshop a second ago. And that's the reason that I'm showing you this. We can see that all the layers here are intact. I have the same number of layers that I started with in Photoshop, which was 14 of them, but you can see that the way it views on screen is very different, and that's because of what's accepted by After Effects and what isn't. We can see that things like the drop shadow around the edge of my lettering and even the bevels around the edge of these studs here is absolutely fine. They're all still in place. However, my lettering is not filled with the original metal backdrop anymore. It does have embossing around the edge, which is okay, but very importantly here, my backdrop has completely disappeared. The reason for that is the backdrop was not just a static Photoshop file, it was actually a pattern fill layer. So I took a small seamless pattern of some rusty metal, made a pattern from it inside of Photoshop. That is not respected when I bring it across into After Effects. So you really do have to keep track of these things and just make sure you're aware of what does come across and what doesn't. And if you come across that, there's many things you can do in Photoshop to make it work. It's not the end of the world, but it will catch you out once in a while until you're aware of them. Now, a couple of things to point out here as well. We can see that some of these layers have a small F next to them. That means they have a filter or an effect applied, which is things like drop shadow and bevel, because After Effects has those, and it obviously converts them across and does the job for us. We also have things like transparency and blending modes. So I have my warning tape here, the yellow warning tape you saw going across the original background. If I select that warning tape layer right here and just hit the T key for transparency, we can see that the opacity setting of 85%, which is what I specified in Photoshop, has also come across and been respected inside of After Effects. And on top of that, if I click the switches and modes at the bottom, we can see that the blending mode for this layer is set to overlay, which is also one that I set inside of Photoshop. So you can see that very generic things like the blending modes and transparency, scale, rotation, that kind of thing are all respected when you bring the file across. It's only certain effects that will catch you out. Now there's a couple of things here that are new to After Effects 6 which are very exciting. First one you can see is that I have blue guides here, and these are live guides inside of After Effects. I can pull them around and reposition them. These are ones that I lay down inside of Photoshop, and I have access to them now inside of After Effects 6. But the other thing which I think is the most important is editable text layers. If we scroll down the timeline, you can see that layers 4 and 5 both begin with the text warning you are watching. And these are the layers for these two lines of text you can see here, which are actually one item inside of Photoshop, and they've been rendered out as two separate layers. One is the text and one is its drop shadow. We can see it has a multiply mode applied. Well, these can be converted back into editable text now inside of After Effects 6, allowing me to make copy changes without having to jump back and forth between Photoshop and After Effects using the Edit Original feature. So we'll make a quick change. If I select layer 4, the first text layer itself, not its shadow, if I go up to the layer menu now and go down to where it says convert to editable text, it will convert that into a typed layer, and you can see its icon changes here in the timeline showing me exactly that. Now I've got my tools hidden at the moment. If I just hit the tab key, I can bring them back into view, and I can access my text tool over here on the right hand side. Just move my character palette out of the way for a second. All I need to do now is click anywhere on the type, wherever it may be. Let's say instead of watching, just click and drag and type in seeing, and we can see that the text is now edited directly inside of After Effects. And this is a huge improvement. It just opens up a lot of faster workflow options. Now you'll see by default, obviously the text has changed, but not the drop shadow, but obviously that's a separate layer. So just to make it easier, I'm actually going to turn off the visibility of the text layer we just converted. So all we see is the drop shadow one. Go ahead and select the drop shadow layer, and once again, go to layer and say convert that to editable text. And even though it's a drop shadow, it's still actually live text. It's had a drop shadow effect applied to it, and also a multiply blending mode, which is basically removing its color. Once again, we can go to the text tool, click and drag over the word watching, which just looks like a drop shadow, type in the new word, and you'll see it's re-rendered as a brand new drop shadow that will match the original text. And we can obviously see that by turning back on the original layer. So you can see there the editable text, very important inside of After Effects 6. Now, one other feature I briefly want to touch on is the use of shape layers from Photoshop inside of After Effects, which come in as masks. The lettering that's here in the center was defined using shape layers inside of Photoshop, and those have come in as editable masks, but there are various rules that define what we can do with those masks. Now, we're actually going to touch on that in the masking lesson, which comes later on in the series, but just for now, just so you know that it comes across, the masks are intact, but we'll focus more on that because there's a few things in there which are not very straightforward to explain. And I'd rather devote time in the section where we're actually working on masking itself. So just so you're aware that that's there. Okay, let's round this up by taking a quick look at Illustrator files and how After Effects deals with importing those. Once again, let's remove those two files we've just been working on. Keep our project window nice and clean. And there is a file here in our project window called splash screen, and that's the one we're going to import. So simply double click to bring up the dialog box, go ahead and choose splash screen, and you'll see that with Illustrator files we have exactly the same options as with Photoshop files. We can import it as a piece of footage and then obviously choose merge layers or choose individual layers at one time. I can choose composition and go for cropped layers, or I can choose composition and obviously use the size of the document itself. But there's something I want to point out here. This isn't actually as clear-cut as it seems. After Effects deals with Illustrator files a little differently to the way that it deals with Photoshop files in terms of layers and document size. So what I'm going to do is choose composition as cropped layers, go ahead and click import, and we'll see that when the file has come in, we can see that it says it's 720 pixels wide, which is correct, but it's 881 deep, okay? Well, that's fine because we did choose cropped layers, which means that we would see the extent of any larger layers. That's absolutely fine. But let's go ahead and delete that and try a second way of doing it. Let's just remove both the composition and the folder itself. Go ahead and do another import, choose the splash screen again, and this time go down and choose composition only, so we're not choosing cropped layers this time. Click import, and we'll see it's exactly the same, 720 by 881. So why didn't it bring it in at crop down, which is 720 by 540, because that is the actual document setup for this file. Well, After Effects needs to see the actual boundaries of Illustrator files. If it sees vector layers that are larger than the background, it treats those as document size. That's just the way that Illustrator works and the way that After Effects works with that program. So we can get around that very easily. Once again, let's get rid of these items, remove those, and let's jump across into Illustrator, actually open that splash screen file inside of Illustrator, and we can see all of the layers here that make it up. We've got a logo with a drop shadow and nice large logo here, a blended transparent item in the background, and also a placed Photoshop file. All those things are there and they will all come across. However, at the top of my layers palette, I have a layer that's hidden. It's called Cropper, and this is something I've set up ready for us to use. If you go ahead and turn on the visibility for that, it's just a large yellow box which is set to 720 by 540. And if you select that and go up to the Object menu, go down here to where it says Crop Marks and choose Make, it will basically remove the yellow box and place a series of crop marks. And this is now defined as the boundary of our Illustrator file, okay? They're not editable, we can't touch them. It's simply a locked device that shows us this is the finished size of our document. So go ahead and hit Command S or Control S on the PC and save that file. Let's close it down, come back over into After Effects, and once again just double click to import that same splash screen as a composition, not cropped layers, but just a general composition, and say import. And now we can see we have the finished size of 720 by 540, which is exactly what I needed. A couple of things to check here then on Illustrator files. If we just double click to open that as a composition, we can see all of the layers here intact. We also have our layer blending modes, just like we saw with Photoshop files, but obviously Illustrator has transparency. So I have a couple of layers here that have been given the hard light blending mode, and that comes across. If I switch back to my switches option, I can also see if I select maybe the Eugene, the large logo in the background, and hit T, its transparency value of 10% has also been respected. Very important. We just collapse that. One more important thing is something called continuous rasterization. Now, first thing I'll do is turn on anti-aliasing by clicking and dragging all the way down this column right here. That turns on smoothing for all of these items, so they're very, very clean. But continuous rasterization is very important when scaling something. A lot of people wonder why I should use Illustrator to create something when they could probably do something very similar in Photoshop. It all comes to do with scaling and what happens to the file when you scale it. If I select the words section here, which is our logo in the very, very center, and hit the S key and just drag on the 100% value so we scale it up, you'll see that as the word total training gets bigger, it obviously gets worse quality. And that's just a problem inherent of pixels, okay? Same as Photoshop files. You scale them up, they're going to get worse in quality. But the beauty of working with an Illustrator file is because it's referencing an original high-res version, that can be changed at any time and re-rendered at high quality using continuous rasterization. All we have to do to access that is click on this small button right here. If I click and hold, you can see it says continuously rasterize. When I let go, you'll see that the graphic is re-rasterized at perfect quality, even though I've gone here up to 569%. If I want to, I can drag on this with the Shift key held down and go much faster, up to maybe 1000%. You can see that it's still very, very sharp quality. So continuous rasterization is very important when dealing with Illustrator files because it just gives you so much more flexibility to scale and create and animate in a very fluid way and not have to worry about the quality of your graphics. Now, one piece of bad news I do have about importing Illustrator files into After Effects is the inability to convert to editable text. That doesn't work with an Illustrator file at this point. I have a line here that says another production. It's layer 2. If I do select that and go up to my layer menu and come down, you can see that convert to editable text is not available. So unfortunately, that cannot be done at this point. However, you can obviously still say edit original and jump back into Illustrator and make that change yourself. So it's just a little workflow thing there. So this pretty much deals with every type of import we have, from Photoshop files, Illustrator files, and sequences and digital movie files. But what about when you're importing video? Very important that things like interlacing and frame rates and pull down. For that kind of information, I'm going to pass you back across to Brian.
Within the topic of video import, there are hours and hours of esoterica we could discuss. Unfortunately, we don't have hours and hours, so I'm going to focus on a few of the things that are most important when it comes to working with video source files in After Effects, particularly related to NTSC video, which is what we use here in the States, although a lot of this information is universal. First of all, NTSC is a very old format, a real dinosaur, technologically speaking. And due to the limitations of 1950s technology, together with the decision of a few engineers who were forced by bureaucrats to figure out a way to piggyback a color TV signal on the same band as black and white, we've been left all these years later with a system of broadcast television that can be challenging to understand, much less manipulate effectively. Take interlacing, for example. Early on, scientists determined that 60 frames per second was a nice frame rate if you wanted to present motion with no worries that it would appear to flicker. And given our nation's standardized 60 Hz electrical system, there was a nice convenient signal to synchronize everything up. The only problem was that a video signal was projected onto the inside of a tube with a little gun, starting in the upper left corner of the screen and painting across one line at a time until the whole frame was painted in. And nobody could make a gun fast enough to do all of this in a 60th of a second, at least not in the middle of the last century. The compromise in this case was to skip some data and only draw in every other line in a 60th of a second, then go back on the second 60th and paint in the lines left out the first time through. The phosphors on the screen would continue to glow long enough to keep the screen from pulsing. This reduced the amount of information that had to be broadcast, while still preserving a sense of smooth motion by delivering 60 frames per second of information and only 30 actual frames of real data. This process is known as interlacing, and it's still part of a normal TV broadcast, even though for years technology has long been able to display a faster, cleaner signal.
Interlacing is really easy to recognize if we just look at a clip that was captured on video. If we check in our movies for this lesson, there's a whole folder called Interlacing Samples. It's only got 2 samples in it actually, but they're enough. I'm going to drag that folder into our project window, make sure we're scrolled all the way to the bottom. And before I let it go, just so we don't accidentally try to interpret these movies as a sequence, I'm going to add the Option key on the Mac or Alt key on Windows and let go. And that'll import the interlacing samples. We've got our big tiger jump movie, and we've got an explosion movie that was originally shot on film. We'll come back to that in just a second. I want you to just double-click on the big tiger movie, bring it in here, and if we look closely at the tiger in this movie, he's moving. And because he was captured on video, the motion results in these little comb-like lines that you see along the edges of the part of the tiger that's moving. As we move forward in the frame, you'll see that wherever he's moving, it's indistinct and everything seems to be broken up into lines. That is interlacing. And if we go forward a few more frames to where he jumps, you'll see really extreme. There we go. You can see just how broken up the lines are in his paw as he moves. Not to mention what a cool piece of video footage this is as this gigantic tiger jumps up on Rick here. Anyway, these lines represent 2 fields of motion or temporal information. You can think of them as subframes if you like.
It doesn't help that there isn't a standard nomenclature for these fields, or rather that there are several mutually confusing standards. For example, you'll hear some people refer to the first field as the odd field, and the second field as the even field. But some equipment likes to refer to the first line as line 1, while others start numbering at line 0, so the odd-even thing can easily fall apart. I prefer After Effects' approach of calling the 2 separate sets of fields upper and lower, which has much less chance of confusion. Upper and lower doesn't necessarily mean first and second, however. Some formats like to display the upper field first, and some the lower, which are exactly the choices you're given in AE's Interpret Footage dialog box, by the way. And it's up to you to find out what setting is appropriate for your system. NTSC DV format is always lower field first, at least. So if you're working with DV, you can count on that. Why is all of this important anyway? Well, you need to know whether your footage has fields and your footage's field order, because After Effects needs to be able to take your 30 frame per second interlaced footage and separate those fields out into individual frames, treating the movie as if it was a 60 frame per second full frame movie for the duration of the project. When you output your final work with fields turned on, After Effects will put everything back together again nice and neat. If it didn't do this, your video quality could really suffer, since each field of video data could potentially get smushed together and leave you with ugly artifacts in your final output. These artifacts are easy to recognize, as you can see in this example.
You also have to be careful to choose the correct field order, because if you don't, you run the risk of getting flipped fields, which is one of the ugliest things that can happen to motion video. If your output ends up looking like the samples you see on screen, you need to re-examine your field order. By the way, if you're watching these DVDs on your computer screen instead of on a TV set, you're not going to see any of these field problems. To see the stuff that we're illustrating here, you need to be watching these DVDs on a TV set. Flipped fields are really easy to diagnose by using After Effects' own clip window on a video clip. Now, we just looked at the video clip in the QuickTime window, right? Looked like this. But if you hold the Option key down or the Alt key down on Windows and double-click, it opens up the clip in After Effects clip window, where we can, just as clearly as we did before, see the interlacing. However, if I interpret this footage to have upper field first, which I know to be correct, and don't worry about this dialog box, we'll come back to it in just a second. Now when I look at my footage here in the After Effects clip window, let me click on it there, the interlacing has been removed, and if I use the right arrow key to advance a frame at a time, I'll be able to see each and every field separated out as if it was a frame. This is great for diagnosis. You can tell that this is what's going on by looking at the counter in the very, very lower left-hand corner of the screen. And you'll see for every 2 bits of information that we move forward, the number only changes once. That's a great tip-off that we're only seeing fields. Now, what does the wrong field order look like? We'll go back to our Interpret Footage dialog box. Again, I'll talk about this in just a second. And choose the wrong field order, lower field first, hit Return. And now when I advance through, you'll see it's as if the tiger is doing a kind of a boogaloo. It's like 1 frame forward, 2 frames back, 1 frame forward, 2 frames back, 1 frame forwards, 2 frames back. That's actually how it would play back. You'd get this stuttery back and forth motion with every single frame, and the results look terrible. That's what flipped fields look like. That's how you can easily diagnose it. By going through a frame at a time, you can very, very easily tell if you're getting true motion or if your motion is staggered. Staggered is bad. Staggered looks terrible. Fortunately, After Effects does a nice job of recognizing and automatically interpreting a lot of different video formats. According to its interpretation rules, which are easily found inside the same folder that houses your After Effects application. There's a text file in here. This is the same on Mac and Windows, called interpretationrules.txt. You can open that up in any old text editor that you like. And I'm not going to go into this right now. I'm not going to talk exactly about how this works, but the first half of the document basically explains everything you need to know pretty clearly. The second half of the document contains actual information. For example, NTSC DV is D1 aspect ratio, lower field first, and so on. Different formats each have their own set of rules. You can edit these rules according to the instructions that are in the document, and you can even add your own rules if you work with a lot of similar footage that you want After Effects to interpret in a similar way. If, as is the case with most of the footage that we're working with in this program, particularly these Art Beats clips that you see here in the program window, After Effects does not automatically interpret the footage, you'll have to do it yourself, and that's easy to do. Steve has already shown you the Interpret Footage dialog box. We're going to pull it up using the keyboard shortcut, which is Command F. Now, Steve mostly talked about the color matting settings in this dialog box. We're more interested in the settings for conforming frame rate. By changing the settings here in the box, we can make the movie conform to any frame rate that we wanted to. For example, if we wanted to slow our footage down a bit, we could conform to 15 frames a second from 30. And this is also where we would separate fields if our clips had fields. These ArtBeat clips don't happen to have fields, so we're going to leave that off. Pull down we'll get to in just a second, as well as the other options. But for now, let's change our frame rate for this clip to 15 frames a second and hit the return key to accept those changes. And now let me show you something cool about interpret footage. If I now right-click on Windows, control-click on the Mac on the clip that we just interpreted footage for, and go back to interpret footage, you'll see now that we've made a change, we have the option to remember the interpretation that we just applied. If I select that, remember interpretation, and now select the other 3 ArtBeats clips that we have in our window here, I can also bring up the interpret footage for them and say apply interpretation. So it's a couple of steps, but this allows you to apply at the same time an interpret footage setting to a whole bunch of different clips, which can be a real time saver. Just to reinforce that, I'm going to return our clips back to their original settings. I'll select the first one and hit Command F. Set my frame rate back to its original by just saying use the frame rate from the file. And accept that with the Enter key. Now I'll say interpret footage, remember interpretation, which is Command Option C. If you think in terms of copy and paste, it's almost the same keyboard shortcut. Just add the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows. So Command Option C remembers interpretation. Select the 3 clips that I want to now modify, and we'll just use the keyboard shortcut Command Option. That would be Control Alt on Windows V to paste. And now all of our settings are returned back to 30 frames per second.
There's another important thing about what I've said so far that many of you have probably already noticed and rolled your eyes about. Of course, video doesn't run at 30 frames a second, really. When NTSC video went from a black and white to a color standard, the solution to do so involved adjusting the frame rate ever so slightly so that instead of running at a convenient, precise 30 frames per second, our video today actually runs very slightly slower, or 29.97 frames per second. For the record, this translates to 59.94 fields per second. If you do a lot of video work, you'll see these 2 numbers a lot. This is also what's known as drop frame timecode. You've probably heard that term before, but don't worry too much about what it means. The only visible difference is that the timecode associated with the clips skips a number every now and again, just to keep the timing of things accurate. It's not actually skipping any real visible frames of information, but you'll definitely want to output to 2997 if your final destination is video. Interlacing is certainly an issue if your original footage was shot on video, since most video cameras record an interlaced image by default. And it's definitely not an issue if all of your source footage was shot with what's called progressive scan, a relatively new video format, or if your footage originated in an animation program and was output without fields, as is the case in most of the ArtBeats clips that are on this disc. But what if the source footage started on film, where things tend to be shot at 24 frames per second, then was transferred to video before you imported it? Well, that's when things can start to behave very strangely. Most Europeans have it relatively easy. The PAL system runs at 25 frames per second, which is close enough to film's 24 that a simple speed adjustment is usually enough to get film onto video. This is also why the running time of movies on PAL video almost never exactly match the original running time of the movies in the theaters. But on NTSC video, the challenge is much greater. 24 frames per second have to somehow be stretched out to fit roughly 30 frames or 60 fields per second. Or to simplify the problem a bit, you need to take 4 frames of film and make them fit on 5 frames of video. This is accomplished with a process called 3-2 pull-down. The practical upshot is that every other frame of film is displayed for a frame and a half of video, so that frame 1 of film equals frame 1 of video, frame 2 of film equals all of frame 2 plus the first field of frame 3 of video, frame 3 of film equals the second half of frame 3 and the first half of frame 4 on video, and frame 4 of film is mapped to the last half of frame 4 and all of frame 5 of the video. So you end up with 3 whole frames and 2 split frames of video for every 4 frames of original film, hence 3:2.
Pull down is pretty easy to see in the Explosion 3:2 movie that's in our Interlacing Samples folder that I had you import a second ago. If I just double click on that so we can see it in the native QuickTime window, let's zoom in on the center of the screen. Let me scroll forward so that there's plenty of stuff on screen. And now let me step through this a frame at a time. And you can see that there are whole frames of data, and then, boom, there's a split frame, a frame that's made up of interlaced lines, clear as a bell. The next frame, interlaced. Then a whole frame, a whole frame, a whole frame, a split frame, right? That's how you can tell if something was shot on 24 frame per second film and then translated to 30 frame per second video. That's what pull down looks like. And when we need to remove the pull down, it's really pretty simple. Just go into the Interpret Footage dialog box. Remember, Command F. We're already separating lower field first because this is a piece of D1 footage, which is fine. That's exactly what we want to do. But we want to remove the pull down. And pull down is handled with this pop-up that you see here or with the buttons that we see down here. Now, we've been talking about 3:2 pull down, and that is the most common pull down you're going to run into. But there are other pull-downs, and as of After Effects 6, some of them are starting to be supported now as well, including the 24PA pull-down, which is a standard for a new high-definition Panasonic camera that's become popular enough that 24PA pull-down has been added here as a button and has also been added in this pop-up. But we're mostly interested in the 3:2 pull-down settings. So if we want to remove the pull-down, of course, we could just have it guess and hope for the best, but you can also dial in the values directly. Now you'll see a bunch of W's and a bunch of S's in here. The W's stand for whole frames. S stands for split frames. So we've got whole, split, split, whole, split, split, whole, etc., etc., etc. And the settings that you see down here at the bottom are for that new Panasonic format that I was just telling you about. Well, I happen to know that this piece of footage is going to work just great with this first setting, so that's what I'm going to choose. If you wanted to, you could go through and choose these one at a time. There's only 5 of them after all to see which one works for your particular clip, but I know this first one's going to work fine for us, so let's choose that. We can see that we've now assumed an effective frame rate of 23.976 frames per second. That is what a 24 frame per second clip looks like when you're running in 2997 drop frame timecode. That's what that means. And we're done.
If you don't remove the pull down and you just remove the fields from a film source, and then you add some motion graphics and render back out to fields, the temporal information of the old and the new elements won't match, and the results can look pretty bad in most situations. It's always best in After Effects to work with a consistent frame rate. So if you have to work with film, separate it out to 24 frames per second. Do all of your work in a 24 frame per second comp. Then output the results to a 29.97 movie with 3:2 pull down enabled on output, and everything will stitch itself back together nicely. Okay, one last important thing to worry about with video. An image is made up of a bunch of little squares of data called pixels, which is short for picture elements. But unlike your computer monitor, most video formats don't use square pixels. They use rectangles. In NTSC, these pixels are a little taller than they are wide, so a perfect circle brought in from Photoshop, which uses square pixels, will get a little squashed into a vertical egg shape when it's displayed on an NTSC screen. PAL pixels are rectangular too, but they're wider than they are tall, so the effect is reversed. After Effects offers many different ways to view square versus rectangular pixels and automatically try and keep up with things throughout the process. Personally, I ignore most of these tools. For one thing, I don't have the time or the skill to offer all of the possible permutations or methodologies for working in and through a rectangular pixel environment. It's very confusing. Many shops have different needs, and a rule that works for one might not work for another. But I will tell you what works for me, what works for Total Training, and what I believe is the simplest way of dealing with rectangular pixels, which is basically don't.
In creating this DVD, for example, my final destination is D1 resolution, or 720 by 486 rectangular pixels, and a D1 aspect ratio of 0.9, or a pixel that's 9/10 as wide as it is tall. But instead of working at this resolution, I prefer to work with a comp width of 720, just as we have here, and a square pixel height equivalent of 540 square pixels. If you have trouble remembering this, don't worry. It's a preset. See? NTSC D1 square pixel 720 by 540. I do all of my work at this resolution with square pixels. Then when I'm done and I'm ready to render, I drop the final composition into a render comp set to 720 by 486 D1 rectangular pixels, fit to fill with the keyboard shortcut Command-Option-F, and render the results. This extra step might add an infinitesimal amount of additional rendering time, but the savings in brain power, not to mention the smaller likelihood of careless mistakes, more than makes up for it. As long as you're careful about properly interpreting your footage and outputting interlaced to the right field order, you'll be good to go. Which brings us to outputting. Let me just cancel out of our composition settings here. Now there's a few different ways to get clips out of After Effects, including exporting clips, which is something that you would do from the project window in general. If you want to take a clip that's an MOV file, for example, a QuickTime file, and you want to turn that into an AVI file, you don't have to add that to the render queue. You don't have to add it to a composition. All you have to do is choose File, Export, and then you're given a variety of formats that you can save that file out as. These are all covered in your After Effects documentation. I'm not going to go into them in too much detail. The export command is also where you find Flash Export, which we'll talk about later in this series. But exporting clips is not really what After Effects is all about. After Effects is all about creating compositions and then saving those compositions and that artistic stuff that you're going to do within the compositions out as new movies or as movie sequences or even as stills if you want to use After Effects just as a compositing tool, which several people do now. So generally speaking, you're going to be working with compositions, not with simply clips, and those compositions are going to be output. So let's take a look at a quick composition. Let's take, for example, the glowing composition that we have here. And then let's maybe drag, I don't know, I mean, it really doesn't matter. So let's drag our big tiger movie into there, and we'll drag that behind, and we'll fit to fill, Command-Option-F. So now we have our T3V glow, the upper left-hand corner of our tiger, and now we've created a composition. Okay, this is good. Let's jump to the out point of our tiger jump so that this makes sense. Hit N to set our work area to the length of our background clip. And now that we've done all of this extraordinary work, let's export this as a movie. And just so we can make this composition easy to find in our project window, I'm going to hit Command-K, that would be Control-K on Windows, and I'm going to change the name of this composition to 1-, the 1, by the way, we'll put it at the top of the list alphabetically, 1-Render Me. Click OK. Now I've changed the name of the composition to Render Me, and if we go over to our comp window, it's the first item in the window. Now, the easiest and simplest and most intuitive way to take the composition that you're currently working on and make a movie out of it is to choose the Composition, Make Movie menu item. Or better yet, since you're making a movie, learn Command-M or Control-M on the PC, and that will introduce us to the render queue. Basically what it does is it takes the composition that we were working in and it puts it here into the render queue, where we can now modify some settings related to how we want to output the movie, and then click Render. We're not going to do that just yet because I want to talk a little bit more about other ways to get items onto the render queue. Let me delete that. Make Movie is a simple way to do it. However, if you have taken the time to generate a RAM preview, which is what I'm doing right now, generating a RAM preview, preloading all of these frames into RAM, which stands for Random Access Memory. And there we are. We've now got a full RAM preview version of that great big tiger. Rick is not a short guy. That tiger towers over him. Love that clip. Now that we've generated a RAM preview, instead of choosing Make Movie, you can say Composition, Save RAM Preview. It'll come up with a window asking you what to name the clip and where you want to put it. We'll just call it Render Me RAM and put it on our desktop and click Save. And then it brings up the render queue and automatically starts rendering the file to the desktop. Now, a side effect of the output module that comes up by default for RAM Preview is that when this render is done, it will also automatically be imported into our project. And there it is, the movie that we just rendered, now imported, complete with the logo we added to it. Hooray! But even that's not always practical because you don't want to wait around for a RAM preview before you can save something out. And really, that's not the power of the render queue. The render queue is all about queuing up multiple renders. This is the way that you will often finish up your day by sending your After Effects projects to the render queue, stuff that you've worked on during the day, and then you will set them all up to render when you go home at night and come in the morning, and you'll have everything wonderfully finished. Of course, that's implying that After Effects is so slow that you need to leave things to render overnight, which couldn't be further from the truth. But there are a lot of times that you're going to want to set up several things to render in quick succession, and After Effects gives you great tools for doing that. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let me delete this item from our render queue again. And I'm going to move my render queue just off to the right here. And let's take a look in our project window. And this time I'm going to select our 4 Art Beats movies. I'm going to drag them to the new composition icon. And I'm going to tell it to make multiple compositions. And all the other settings are just fine. I'll click Enter to accept that. So now we have a whole bunch of comps to work with here in our project window. Well, anytime you have multiple compositions like this, you can just select them and drag them straight into the render queue, and that adds all of them to the render queue at the same time. Very handy. Let me undo that. There's also a keyboard shortcut that I've been using for so many years that I always have to kind of think about it before I tell people what it is, because it's just completely automatic. It is Command-Shift/, that's Control-Shift/ on Windows, to add selected items to the render queue. Let me undo that. It'll only undo them one at a time, so I have to undo 5 times to get rid of the 5 items. I'm going to now deselect my first item and delete the comps that I just created. Yes, I really want to delete them. The items that I just created by dragging and dropping onto the new composition icon. And note, if I do that again, one of the options that it gives me here in the box is to add to render queue. The purpose of this is you could bring in a whole bunch of clips, just drag them to new compositions, and simultaneously add them to render queue. And then when you go in and do whatever work that you have to do to them, they're already set up and ready to be output, which is a nice shortcut. But there's also times when you just want to use After Effects as a nice batch processing application. You want to bring in a bunch of QuickTime movies and maybe save them out as sequential stills or something. Basically, you want to convert from one format to the other. After Effects allows you to do that even simpler than this. If I hit the Escape key, let's go up, and once again, just select our ArtBeats clips, and instead of dragging them to the comp window, I'm just going to drag the clips over to the render queue and let go. And when I do, After Effects automatically creates new compositions for those clips and adds the compositions to the render queue. So very, very quick and easy way to use After Effects as a batch processor. Just bring in the clips that you want to work with, drag them straight to the render queue. After Effects will create a composition, the size and length of each clip, and set things up ready to be output. Well, now that I have a few items in the render queue, let's take a closer look at our render queue settings. Let me just bring our window down where we can see it. Looks pretty good. I'm going to hit the F2 key to deselect everything, and then we're just going to look at the very first clip's settings. The render settings are one of the first and most important things that you'll want to set. If we twirl open the little twirly next to render settings, it'll show us what our current settings are. Basically quality, resolution, size, etc. All of this is pretty easy to understand, and if it isn't, we'll either tell you about it now or we'll be talking about it later in the series. But instead of just checking out our settings, let's actually alter our settings. Now there's a pop-up box here next to current settings that allows us to choose from presets. Current settings, best settings, draft settings, multi-machine settings, and custom. Best settings basically just turns everything to best quality. This is very, very often what you're just going to want to go to. You aren't going to need to adjust anything more custom than that. But let's take a look at best settings. Best gets us mostly where we want to go, but if we look at all of our settings here, and this is probably not the way you're going to work, checking out the settings, but a quick glance at this tells us that, oops, we're rendering to 30 frames a second, and assuming we really want video, we need to change that. So let's click on the blue underlined best settings, and that's going to bring up our render settings box. This allows us to customize the settings any way that we like. For example, we could adjust our quality to something else, our resolution to something else, frame blending, field render, etc. If we were rendering something that needed to be rendered to a field order, this is where you would choose that, as well as where you would introduce pull down. Remember, we talked about pull down a little bit earlier. This is also where you can override motion blur settings, turn motion blur back on if, for example, you've turned it off in the comp window temporarily just to speed up previews and you've forgotten that. Whoops, you can make it come back on again here. The shutter angle has to do with how much blur that you get for a layer. We'll talk about that later. Proxy use, again, chat about that later. Effects, generally speaking, you want to keep this set to current settings. Very often when you're experimenting with effects, you can accidentally leave effects applied to layers that are turned off. And usually when you do that, you don't want those effects to actually render. In fact, a great troubleshooting tip is sometimes if things are rendering and looking completely different at render time than they do when you're working with them, in all likelihood, you have a couple of effects applied to some layers that are turned off, and you've got your render set to render all effects on, and it's applying those effects and changing the look. This comes up a lot when people are having trouble. Fortunately, that problem has gone away now that the default setting for best is to render to current settings and not to all on. The time span we'll talk about in just a minute, but here's what we want to change. It's a little mangled here under OS X as far as the screen redraw is concerned, but we want to use a custom frame rate, not the comp's frame rate. We want to use 29.97 because we're going out to video, and click OK. Now, our render settings are telling us that we now have a custom setting based on our best settings. So we started with best and we changed one property. So we're basically now about to render to settings that are based on best settings. Now that we've done this, now that we've changed something, we can actually save this as a preset. If we go into this pop-up again and say Make Template, we can accept the settings that we've just created as a new item in our render settings. So we'll call this best 2997. So this will basically give us all of our best settings, but force the frame rate to 29.97 no matter what it starts at. Click OK. Now, there it is. The name here is changed to best 2997, and we can choose it here from our presets. It's now a permanent part of our presets, at least until we delete our After Effects preferences again. So now that we have that as a preset, let's talk about some of the batch processing things that you can do here in this window. And this is where the window really gets powerful. We know all 4 of these Art Beats clips came in the same way. We want to export all 4 of them the same way. So we can select the clips now that have not been conformed to these new settings that we came up with. So all we have to do is select them all, and under Render Settings, choose Best 2997, and now that will be applied to all 3. So a real time saver. Created ourselves our own custom template, and we applied it to multiple items. So changing render settings are all about setting the quality of our final render. The output module, on the other hand, allows us to choose the format of the movie that we're going to be outputting here from After Effects. Now there's a bunch of different formats to choose from. We'll select our first clip again here and take a look at the presets that are available to us. Lossless in QuickTime means animation set to best quality. That means it's a lossless, pixel-perfect copy of what you're seeing here in After Effects. The advantage to using animation over something like none is that it actually does what's called run length compression, where it results in a smaller file without actually compromising the image quality at all. Animation set to most is absolutely lossless. It also happens to be a format that supports alpha channels should you need them, hence the preset lossless with alpha that I have on my machine down here. You probably don't have this on yours, but I'll show you how to create it. You can also just export the alpha channel by itself. Talk about why you might want to do that in just a second. And this is also where you'd set up things like animated GIFs, exporting the audio clip, multi-machine sequence, which basically is how you create batch processing. If you have the production bundle of After Effects, you can hook a bunch of machines up to a render folder and batch process a single project. You can also export a Photoshop sequence, and as we saw a second ago, you can export a RAM preview. But we're going to create custom settings here. We're basically going to recreate this lossless with alpha. Choose Custom. Let me bring our window down a smidge. So you can see this is where we choose the format. If you are on an Apple machine, as we are right here, it defaults to QuickTime. If you're on Windows, at the time of this recording, it defaults to AVI. So you might see something different in this pop-up on a Windows machine. But the point of the pop-up is that you can choose from a whole ton of different formats. We're just going to stick with QuickTime for now. Embed allows you to do one of three different things. Obviously, you can embed nothing. That's one thing, which is sort of not doing anything. So Project Link allows you to take advantage of Adobe Application's ability to edit original, meaning you've already seen here in After Effects how if you hit Command-E on the Mac, Control-E on Windows, you can launch Photoshop and then edit a Photoshop file that you've imported and then come back into After Effects and continue working with it. Well, embedding a project link allows you to do the same thing from a video editing application. So say you were working in Premiere and you wanted to go back and readjust an animation you'd created. If you had embedded a project link, hitting Command-E or Control-E in Premiere will allow you to launch After Effects and continue. A perhaps more important new thing added in 5.5 is the ability to not only embed a project link, but to also embed a copy of the project into the QuickTime movie, which means later on, 2 years down the road, if all you have is your QuickTime movie lying around on your desktop and you need to go back and tweak the file that created that movie, you could actually import that file into After Effects as a project, and it will essentially expand the movie out and show you the names of all of the source files that you originally used to create that project and will help you actually reconstruct your work. So this is an important, wonderful new addition to AE 5.5, this ability to embed a copy of the project into a movie. For now, though, let's just choose none. Don't need any of that. Post-render action is something we're going to get into a little bit later in the series, mostly when we're talking about doing high-end compositing. But for now, I'll just show you that one of the things it allows you to do is just import your rendered movie once you're done rendering it, which can be very, very useful. You can also import and replace usage, which allows you to basically sub-select an element in a composition, render that out, and automatically import and replace it. We'll talk about that later. Ditto with proxy. For now, we'll keep post-render action set to none. Video output, here's where we check our format. We know we're rendering to QuickTime, but QuickTime has a whole bunch of different codecs. You choose the codec from the Format Options box, which allows us to choose, for example, animation, which, as I said, is an excellent format for preserving your image quality. There's the DV formats, obviously. Those are very useful if you're working with DV footage. And if you've installed any custom codecs, those will be available to you in that pop-up. An important thing to us here is depth, millions of colors. We want to save an alpha channel, so we would rather save to millions of colors plus. Here in this pop-up, keep things set to best and hit the return key to accept that as OK. Now, even if we didn't do that in the Format Options box, we could still adjust here in the Channels pop-up RGB plus alpha, which does the same thing that we did a second ago, millions of colors plus. Depth, millions of colors plus. That's what RGB plus alpha means. And color pre-multiplied. That's fine. So now we've essentially set up an output module that outputs a lossless movie, but also outputs the alpha channel. That's great. So we're going to accept that by hitting the Enter key. And now you'll see, just as we saw before with our render settings, our output module now says based on lossless. And just as we did before, if we bring up our output module pop-up, we can select Make Template and give our template a name. Once again, we'll call this lossless with alpha. That may or may not be exactly what I called it before, but we'll click OK. And now you'll see that name appears right here in the render queue. And if I select the other three items in the queue and choose under Output Module, Lossless with Alpha, pick either one, doesn't matter, it is not going to work applying it to multiple items. How come? Well, it's because output modules work slightly differently than the render settings do. You don't get the opportunity to apply multiple output modules to multiple selected compositions by simply highlighting the compositions. I'll explain why in just a second. But the way to get around this is instead of selecting the actual composition name, select the output module name itself. In fact, if we click on the top one here, this will be a little bit more dramatic. Hold the Shift key down and select the last element in the list that you want to modify its output module. So now we've selected all four output modules, and now on any of these, if I just re-choose Lossless with Alpha, that'll now apply itself to all four elements. Why is it set up this way? Why does it work this way instead of simply selecting the comp name? Because a very, very cool thing about the render queue is it allows you to render one movie and save it out in several different formats all at the same time. This is what's known as setting multiple output modules, and it's really, really easy to do. Just select the elements that you want to add an output module to, and go up to the Composition menu and choose Add Output Module. And now that adds a second module to all of our selected elements. A great example of why you would want to do this is, say you're working with somebody who's on an older style Avid machine, and that the Avid codec that you need to render to doesn't support alpha channels, but you want to provide them with an animation that also has transparency information so that they can basically overlay that animation onto some other elements. If we expand our render queue out a little bit here, I can show you that you can select the first output module for each of these elements and set it to render lossless, and then select the second output module for each one and set it to render alpha only. And when you choose that, each render pass for each of these compositions is now going to save two movies, one that contains the RGB in a single file, and one that contains just the alpha channel as a grayscale layer in another file. Then the Avid user could combine those two back in their own application and create the same transparency that you would get from exporting a lossless file with a built-in alpha channel. Another reason you might want to create separate output modules is that you might want to create a web clip of a movie at the same time that you output a broadcast clip of that same movie, in which case you might actually want to scale the clip. Well, you can do that in the output module settings as well. You'll find that here in the stretch settings. You can also crop a clip here in the output module settings. The only important thing I want to tell you about the stretch settings is that you really don't want to use stretch if you're outputting interlaced material. With interlaced material, it is extremely important that each individual line that it's outputting precisely line up on either the odd or even line that it's intended to line up with. If you go stretching your footage, if you go growing it or shrinking it, you are almost certainly going to affect the order of the interlaced lines, and the results are going to look crummy. Never ever stretch interlaced output. Very dangerous thing to do. It's similarly important with crop. If you're going to be cropping an image that has interlaced output, it's extremely important that this top value remain an even number unless you're purposely trying to flip the fields. If, for example, you want to render out a DV clip that's 720 by 480, but you want to save it out as a D1 clip that's 720 by 486, you don't want to just create a negative crop of 3 lines at the top and 3 lines at the bottom. That will result in a final image that's 720 by 486, but it's also going to reverse the field order. So only crop elements with fields if you're cropping the top value to an even number. Hopefully that'll make sense to those of you who really understand what the problem is there. But crop the top value to an even number if you don't want to flip the fields. Anyway, I'm going to delete that second output module. In fact, I'm going to delete 3 of the 4 clips that I have in here. I'm going to tell After Effects to render this movie basically to our desktop. That's fine. Click Save. Let me bring this down so we can see it right. Good. And I'm just going to click Render. This should rip through fairly quickly. After all, we're essentially just rendering out a movie without doing anything else to it. Now, if you want to, you can twirl open the render details, and that'll tell us exactly what After Effects is doing and thinking about. If you're getting a slow render, this is a good place to come look. If you can actually see what After Effects is thinking the most about, you can often troubleshoot your render and maybe speed things up. When the render is finished, you get that wonderful magic happy sound that we just heard, and a movie should be sitting on your desktop now, waiting to be dealt with. Now sometimes, very often actually, in the course of work, you're going to be doing intermediate renders. You're going to render something, and you're going to look at it, and you're going to say, you know, I wish I'd fixed something in it, and then you're going to want to duplicate your clip and render again. Now you can just select a clip here in the render queue window and hit Command-D on the Mac, Control-D on Windows, to duplicate the clip, but when you do, it's going to duplicate the clip and suggest a new name for that clip because it doesn't want to write over the previous clip. But if you don't care, if you want it to write over that previous clip, if you want to get rid of that previous clip altogether, let me delete that. Select this again. Use this magical keyboard shortcut. It's Command-Shift-D, that's Control-Shift-D on Windows, to duplicate a comp with all of its current settings, including the name of the clip. So now that I've done that, Command-Shift-D, basically when I click render, I am now going to overwrite the movie that I just created. This can actually be a dangerous thing to do if for some reason you didn't want to overwrite that previous clip, but it can also be a dangerous thing to do leaving multiple copies of clips lying around on your hard drive for fear that later somebody grabs the wrong one. If you want to make sure that what's sitting on your hard drive is the only finished version of the movie, then use Command-Shift-D. It will overwrite the previous copy. And now when we click render, it will write directly on top of that movie and replace it with the current render. And there, our magic has happened again. Now, as you work, you'll see that the render queue begins to contain kind of a track record of where you've been. I kind of like this. Now, a lot of people will just delete files from the render queue once they're done. But I actually like to hold on to these because very, very often when you're working on complex work, it can be useful to keep these files around. And one of the most useful things you can have is way over here on the right, and that's the render time. It tells you exactly how long it took to render your clips. Now, the second clip rendered 14 seconds. The first clip took 24 seconds. That's because the first time the clip rendered through, it actually buffered things into RAM. So the second time was roughly the equivalent of a RAM preview, I think. So it went a lot quicker. But just like other elements in After Effects, you have the ability to view various useful pieces of information here in the render queue by adjusting these tabs along the top. You can actually find yourself sometimes with these tabs scaled way out, and you don't know why you can't see your render time. Well, it usually means that one of your tabs, perhaps the comp name tab, has gotten itself really expanded out wide. Just bring it back over again, and you'll bring your render time and your start time back in again. But the render queue is a really great way to manage the exporting of compositions in After Effects. Let's talk about one other quick thing here in exporting files. Let me duplicate, Command-D, Control-D on Windows, our previous clip. And for an output module, instead of lossless, I want to actually output a sequence. So I'm going to click on the lossless here and bring up our output module settings. And under Format, I'm going to choose, say, a TIFF sequence. Okay? 24 bits per pixel is fine. Let's use LZW compression so it's a little bit smaller. Click OK. All of this is fine. And now I'm going to hit Enter. Now, the output module file name has been trimmed to AB Digital Moods B to accommodate the sequence numbering. After Effects, as of version 5.5, is still not able to take advantage of these incredibly long file names that you can get in certain operating systems. So when you've got an overly long file name, After Effects is going to actually trim it for you. Why did this name suddenly get long? Because we're outputting an image sequence. Let me show you what I mean. When I click OK, the name of our exported file has changed down here in the timeline to AB Digital Moods B, and then a whole bunch of these number signs in brackets. What do these mean? Well, if we click on that, we can actually edit that. First of all, once again, it's asking us where it wants to output stuff. We wouldn't really want to output a bunch of sequential TIFFs to just the desktop because it's going to leave them all piled there on the desktop. We're going to have hundreds of files on the desktop. So we would want to create a new folder. So if we click on New Folder and say Output TIFFs and Create. So now we're in our Output TIFFs folder, and we're going to save a whole bunch of files called AB Digital Moods B _ and then a 5-digit number. Okay, that's what these numbers are telling us, is that it's basically going to start with 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. And then the next frame will be 0, 0, 0, 0, 2, and so on. If we know that our animation is only a couple hundred frames long, we don't need all of these numbers here. We don't need them. So you can actually delete a couple of these number signs and shorten the name of our movie clip up a little bit. So the number signs are completely customizable. If you don't want them to appear at this point in the name, for example, say you want them earlier on so that you can sort by the numbers. You could put them at the beginning if you wanted to by cutting them with Command X and pasting them at the beginning. So now we would start with a leading number followed by AB Digital Moods B.TIFF. Click Save. And now when we render that out, it'll automatically number all of the files and deposit them into the folder that we just created on the desktop. You'll see it takes a little bit longer to render than our previous clips did. But the end result is that we'll have a sequence of image files instead of a single self-contained movie file. So those are a few things about the render queue that you need to know. There's other stuff that goes on in there, but in all likelihood, we'll be revisiting this window again and again throughout the series. So if we've left out anything important, you can count on us visiting it again as we go along for the next few hours. Now, before we wrap up this disk, there's a few other things we need to know about After Effects, primarily related to various preferences that you should be aware of to get the most out of the application. And for that, I'm going to send you back over to Steve Holmes, and he's going to talk about After Effects preference settings.
Okay, from my source files folder, I've got a project in here called prefs.aep, which I'm just going to open so we can actually have a file to work with when we go through some of our preferences. And the first thing I'm going to do is go up to my After Effects menu, come down to Preferences, and just go to the first option, which is General. Now, you've seen me go into these dialog boxes before in some of the previous lessons, so you should be familiar with the location of this now. So let's go to General, bring up the General Preferences dialog box. And the first option we have here is that the amount of undo levels that we have inside of After Effects, which you see you can customize between 1 and 99 commands in one go. 20 is set up as the average, which is fairly good. Depending on the amount of RAM that you have, you can obviously increase or decrease this accordingly. I normally aim around about 30 or 40 levels, so I may just push that up to 30 just for this instance. Now, a couple of other options down here showing tooltips you are probably familiar with. Whenever we're rolling over any of the specific icons that appear in the palettes or the menus or even the toolbar, we get the standard tooltips that come up with most Adobe applications. Well, this gives us the option to obviously enable or disable these. Tabbed windows is something that's quite different as well. Now, if I just pull this window out of the way, you can see that this comp window we have in the background here is showing me one of our tabs that we have over here. This means that every time we open a composition, it opens up in this same comp window with another tab that allows you to switch back and forth between these different compositions. If I disable tabbed windows, it's not going to allow me to do that. Every composition will open up in its own window. So let me just quickly do that. Let's say OK. We have this composition open already. I'm going to come back to my project window and choose a second comp. And you'll see it's actually open in a new window on top of the old one, okay, because it's not part of the original tabbing function. So I'm just going to go ahead and close that. Bring my preferences back up again. I'm using a keyboard shortcut now, which is Command-Option: on the Mac or Alt-Control: on the PC, just to bring up this dialog box a little bit quicker each time. And I'll go back and turn tabbed windows on. Now, whilst we're also dealing with the windows that we have open, we have another button here that says Close Multiple Views Simultaneously. Now, that one is set off as a default because it's probably one of the most preferred ways that you wish to work, and I'm just going to show you for why. Let me click OK and exit this dialog box and come up to the window menu at the top. Go to my workspace options, and you'll see that we do have a default option in here that says 4 comp views. Now, if I select that, what it does, it generates 4 brand new views for my composition. And if we are working more in 3D-based files in After Effects, this would be very handy because obviously we can set each of these views to a different angle from which we're looking through the camera. Now, the idea of closing the windows simultaneously means that if I go ahead and close one of these, it doesn't close down the others. It's still keeping these 3 open. If I bring my preferences back again, and I'm going to turn on that same option, Close Multiple Windows Simultaneously, and say OK, what will happen now is when I go and close one of these, it shuts them all down and closes the whole composition at the same time. So that's definitely worth bearing in mind when you're dealing with multiple view compositions. Now, this can get a bit confusing in another respect. I'm just going to go back to my preferences again, set that option back to its default because that's the way I would like to keep it. And then I'm going to go back to that original second composition over here in my project window, open it again, and you see it's remembering the settings I had last time. Over under the window menu, we do have yet another option. We have one that says Closed All and one that says Closing in Groups. Now, this is the one I don't want to confuse it with because Closing in Groups actually refers to the grouping of a preview window and the timeline at the bottom. Now, that means that if this was a single preview window, I could close this down and it will close the timeline as well because Closing in Groups is turned on. Let me just go back to my main workspace, D1 half res. And I will show you that same thing we've been doing all this time as well. If I close down the window, obviously the timeline goes with it. Let's come back up, open that file again, and this time under the window menu, turn off Closing in Groups. That means I can now close down the comp window, but still see my timeline, and vice versa. If I pull up the other one, I can do exactly the same. So don't confuse that with closing multiple views. That's not the same thing. That's the reason we have a separate preference under the Preferences menu. So let me just click down here on the right side of my timeline on the Composition button. There we go. Let's pull that back in and just go back to the same Preferences dialog box. The next button we have here is the Switches, Effects, Nested Comps. Now, what I'm going to do is leave that on for a second so we can see what it does. Let's just go back and hit OK. And if I come to my main composition window here, I actually have, if I look down in my timeline, I actually have two compositions in here. You see I have this AB digital file here, which was actually brought in as a pre-composed layer, and the original sort of gold swirly movie you can see in the background. So this is a composition that is already existing in our project window that's been nested in here. If I Option double click that just to open it, you can see that the main window has come up here and shown me that here's my layer with which it's set. And if I come down here just to my switches and look at my options, you can see that my anti-aliasing object is turned off. Now let's say I had 4 or 5 layers in here that all had the same thing. The anti-aliasing was not turned on. I have the ability to come back to this original composition here. So again, let's come to switches so we can see what we're doing. And you'll see that this item has its anti-aliasing turned off because I haven't set that yet. Now the Switches, Effects, Nested Compositions means if I click on here and set the anti-aliasing quality to high, and we now come back to the other composition, you see that preference has gone all the way through and will apply it to all of the layers in here that did not have that. Now, whilst that's a great feature, there's also something you have to bear in mind. If you're dealing with lines or square elements or straight-edged elements that require not to be anti-aliased, i.e. a line that's maybe a pixel in size that might be in a certain position on screen, you don't wish that to anti-alias because you want to keep its crispness. Turning on anti-aliasing this way by basically not knowing or not being aware that you might do it by turning on this option in the main composition and then it revealing itself in the nested composition, you might end up with anti-alias lines that you're not aware of. So do be careful about that when you use this switch option. Other switches that do work their way through as well are the Master Motion Blur options, which will allow you to turn on the Master Motion Blur in the outer composition and see it inside the nested one. Frame blending is the same. And also things like the actual quality of the preview here. If I come back over to this one, come up to our comp preview here and say, let's drop that down to a 3rd quality, and then I come back to the composition that's nested inside it, you see that has also reduced itself to a 3rd. So that's just something worth bearing in mind, and that's why it's there inside of your preferences. Now let's go back to the main composition. Let's push the quality back up to full size. And again, I'm just going to pull up my preferences dialog with the shortcut and go through the next option, which says Default Spatial Interpolation to Linear. Now this is pretty important when you're doing basic animation inside of After Effects. The default interpolation that's used when animating a layer is Bezier. Now let me show you what I mean. If I come back to my main composition window, I'm just going to go to the Layer menu at the top of the screen, come down to New and say Create a Solid, and I'll quickly just create this one at about, let's go 80 pixels square, that will do just fine. And I'll quickly change the background color to something lighter so it stands out on our background. And here we can see our solid. What I'm going to do is just move that to a different part of the screen. Then I'm going to use my keyboard shortcut, which is Option P, and that will apply a keyframe for this object's position at this point in time. What I'm going to do is in the timeline just scroll across to maybe a couple of seconds down the animation. You can see that changing here in the comp window. And let's just move that down into position. Go across to 4 seconds. Pull that over here. Now you'll see that the default path we have is Bezier. The Bezier handles are visible here and we can use them to edit the path. What this preference is saying in the dialog box is it could allow us to do everything as linear animation instead. Now if you are going to be doing just one animation that is purely linear based, then that would be a good time to turn that on as a specific function. What I can do though is when I'm going through the animation process, I can switch between Bezier and linear motion purely by a shortcut. So what I'm going to do is just hit Command Z and back up a few steps. So we go back to that original keyframe. So I've still got the original keyframe at 0 and I'm now at 2 seconds along. What I can do is move this down into that second position. And then if I move my cursor over the anchor point in the center and hold down the Apple key or the control key on the PC and click on that anchor point, I will actually remove the Bezier handle and now I'm using linear interpolation only. That means if we now go across to 4 seconds and pull this into a new location, you'll see that we have a linear point from here. Let's just do another one. At 6 seconds approximately. You see again we have these linear points, but now what I can do is again Apple or control click on here, and we've now turned this back into a Bezier, but on this side. Let's scroll out to 8 seconds, pull that round, and you'll see we now have a Bezier path that's come around that particular point because again we switched. So the preference is there if you want to set it on a permanent basis, but you can see that this shortcut is extremely handy if you want to do it more on the fly, which is definitely something you might want to do in more intense animation purposes. So I'm just going to flick back to my preferences again and make sure that option stays off, which obviously I've left it in that case because I know I can use the shortcut. The next option here, preserving constant vertex count, is to do with masking, and that's something I'm going to approach in very much more detail later on, so I'm going to leave that where it is, but just so you're aware of where in the preferences it appears. And the last option I want to cover in this window is the synchronize time of all related items. If I turn this on and hit OK, I'm going to come back to my animation, and down the bottom here we have those two layers that we were using before. So we have the original background movie here and the pre-composed layer. So this is another nested item. And I'm just going to take that nested item and move it along in the timeline so it starts around about 2 seconds. I can always come here and double check. There we go. Now let's say I needed to do a change to the contents of this nested composition, but it needed to be in synchronization with where we are in this part of the animation. So I need it to happen at 3 seconds overall. Now that would be 1 second into the timeline here of this particular element. So if I again Option or Alt double click this to open up its composition, you'll see that its timeline marker has moved across to 1 second down the timeline because we have that option turned on in the preferences. So it's keeping it synchronized so we can see that this point in this animation directly relates to this point in the other animation. So it's a great way of keeping track of what's going on between different nested compositions so you don't adjust the synchronization without realizing it. Again, I'll just pull up the preferences and turn that one off as a default. Let's go into the next set of preferences now, which comes under General here, and you can see that we have Previews as the very next option. Another way to go through these is obviously to come across here on the right-hand side and click the Next or the Previous Preference option. So I can hit Next, and that takes us straight to Previews as well. Now, the first option we have here is to say use wireframe interactions, whilst the Option key is either down or up. Now, depending on which way you set this, you can pretty much override it by using the Option key in the main window. So I'm going to leave that set and show you very quickly what I mean. I'll just click OK, come back again to this main window, and if I pick up the solid here and decide to move it around the screen, you see that by default we're getting a rendered preview of this. Now if you want to speed things up because you may have multiple layers behind with things like effects or transparency applied and it's going to get slow to drag this around, holding down the Option key after I drag will actually turn on the wireframe interaction, which allows me to move much faster around the screen. If I want to, again, I could just let go at any point and pull back the standard. So what you've set inside the preferences you can override by holding down that Option key. So again, do bear that in mind. Let me pull the preferences back up again, go to Next, and you'll see that the next option is Use Dynamic Resolution. Now Brian's already gone through and shown you how dynamic resolution works in After Effects, and it's extremely handy for speeding up your scrolling and previewing of multi-layered and very intense files in After Effects. What this option allows you to do is go through and specify the amount of degradation that is used when you activate that function. By default, it's set 1 to 4, which means every 4 pixels will be turned into 1. So it's 4 in every direction, so basically 16 pixels. And you can go as high as 1 to 8 or even down to 1 to 2. So it's worth just bearing that option in mind as to where it exists. We also have an audio preview function down here. With this latest version of After Effects, you can see that the duration is set to 8 seconds by default preview. So when we hit the period key on the keypad and do an audio preview, by default it's going to give us an 8-second value. We can obviously go through here and set the sample rate as to how good a quality we need to do that. Obviously, the less quality you do, the faster it will be to preview, but audio preview is a very fast function anyway, so I normally set mine around the standard result there. We also have 16-bit as opposed to 8-bit quality, and obviously we have stereo and mono quality as well. So these are just options you can specify for when you're playing around with the audio preview. If we go across to the next button again on the right-hand side, we get to the display options. And the first item we have under here is the motion path. Now this deals with the number of keyframes that you see in your composition window when you have an element animating like this that we see here in the background. You can see that the moment my preference is set to show no more than 15 seconds of keyframes, well that's actually 15 seconds around the current keyframe that we're viewing. So if we were halfway down the animation, we'd be able to see about 7.5 seconds of keyframes each side. And you'll see that in this instance we do only have a 10-second animation, so we can see all of the keyframes. What we can do is turn it all off and say no motion path. We can say show all keyframes regardless, so we'll see every single keyframe on that timeline. We can say show no more than a specific number of keyframes, again around the one that we're currently looking at, or redefine a new time here. If I just quickly go ahead and say choose no more than 5 keyframes, say OK, you can see that as I drag my time cursor along in the timeline, the number of keyframes is changing according to where I am in the preview. So it's actually counting those across and displaying them as I go along. So this is very handy if you have multiple layers with many thousands of keyframes and it's quite a long timeline. You can obviously cut this down to make it a little bit easier to see what's going on, because too much keyframe information can get quite confusing on the screen. So again, let's pull up the Preferences window, and then we can click Next twice now because we've gone a little bit further down, and look at these options at the bottom. The first one says Disable Thumbnails in the Project window. Again, another important one for speed. Down the left-hand side of our project window here, we have these compositions. The file icons we see are obviously preset by the type of file it comes from, and Photoshop icons have their own. But the composition icon itself, you see up here, it displays the contents of that composition. Depending on the type of work you're doing in there, let's say you're doing multiple layers with particle effects and layer blending modes, that can actually take quite a long time to preview an individual frame of that, which is what's going to be rendered in here. So if it's taking its time to display these each time you come into After Effects, just turn this option off and that will bypass that, and you'll just basically see a blank box in here, or the background color of the composition. So it's worth remembering. The auto zoom when resolution changes, this is a preference that I know Brian and myself get quite frustrated about sometimes. If I have this turned on, I come and click OK, and then come back to my composition window, I have the actual quality of the composition available here. And you see, as soon as I say let's go down to third quality, the window zooms down as well. Now that can be quite frustrating. If I want to change the quality, I might want the graphics to stay at 100% size, because that's the size I wish to work at. And obviously I can use Command or Control plus and minus to zoom up on that, still leaving it as third quality, which is where I might want to end up. So instead of choosing that option, I will go back to those preferences. Again, just hit Next a couple of times to take us back to that same point and turn off the auto zoom when resolution changes. Again, just hit OK, just confirm that. And back in the main composition, if I choose to set that back up to full, and again down to third quality, the window will stay 100% size. Again, that's just one of those preferences that you might choose to set in your own direction. Again, I'll bring up the press window. A couple of clicks take us down the line. And another option here is Show Rendering in Progress in the Info palette. After Effects' Info palette will display information about the files that you are rendering as you go through it when you're doing a RAM preview. Now this is handy because it will allow you to see certain layers that might be causing a slowdown in the rendering pipeline, which are quite easy to recognize, and then you might wish to edit them and change that if that's becoming an issue. And the thing to remember, as well as being able to notify issues inside rendering or RAM preview because of the number of layers in there, you do get this feedback every time you progress to a new frame in a composition anyway. But this is just an option you can turn on, so it's always available in the info palette. Again, it's one of those things you may find quite handy as you go along. Now down here we have the default height of the timeline graphs, which shows the height of the cells which are used to display the information for things like velocity curves inside geometric transformations. As a default is set to 4, if I just click OK and come down to my timeline, and come down to the position option for this top layer that I've animated, you'll see that this is the area that we're talking about here. Now, as well as going into the preferences and setting it, it is very easy just to click on the bottom here and drag and adjust the size of that cell to suit your own preferences. Depending on the number of layers you have and the number of layers you have open showing this velocity curve, you might want to go into the preferences and maybe even change it to something smaller than 4 rather than the default value. But clicking and dragging in here is just as easy. Again, it's up to you if you wish to set that preference. Now we can go back to the Preferences window and go to the next option. By clicking on the right-hand side here, we'll go to the pasteboard color and the hot text color. Very quick and easy things. The pasteboard color is what you see in the background here around the outside of your composition. Let's say you're doing a movie that's going to be displayed on a yellow web page. You want to see exactly what it looks like on a yellow background. You can quite easily go down, choose a new color in here, and then apply that to the background. I'm not going to set that, but again, just to let you know that it's there. And the hot text color that's highlighted here actually refers to items such as the timing option here, which is basically hot. It's active. It means you can click on it and call up a function. So again, it's your preference as to how bright and punchy you want that to notify you. If we then go on to the next option here, we get some very simple and straightforward import options. First one of which Brian has already shown you. It's talking about when you import still footage into After Effects, whether each one comes into the default duration of the whole composition or whether you wish to confine it down to a specific length just by choosing that. So handy if you're maybe going to import a bunch of layers and then use sequence layers to offset them, but you can obviously trim either one of these down or up regardless of which option you choose when it comes in. But again, it's one of those preferences that you may call on as and when you need it. Sequence footage, you can actually tell it to conform to a different frame rate when it's been brought in and rendered. Folders of multiple files that you import as a sequence, you can just tell that's conformed to something other than the regulation 30 frames a second. The interpret unlabeled alpha, we've obviously gone extensively over alpha channel import using Photoshop files. You can see here that you specify a preference for a default every time you're required to notify an alpha channel. So we just usually say ask user. It calls up a dialog box and asks you what you want to do. You could obviously go through, again, if you're doing a batch process and you know each one's going to be the same, just choose one of these and it will go through and ignore the actual dialog box and choose one of these options immediately. So bear that one in mind. And the default drag import, we've already seen this one. We can drag from the desktop either as footage or composition immediately just by choosing one of these options. Again, if we go and click next, we're onto the output options. Now, when we render a movie out, as Brian's already specified regarding some of the output preferences earlier on, you can see that our overflow volumes allow us to overflow movies when they're being rendered if our drive fills up, and we can choose here the type of scratch disks or the hard drives available through which we wish to flow this footage into, and you can have up to 5 of those, so there's plenty of space available if you have the drives there. When you're rendering those movies, you can wish to segment the sequences, if you wish, at a certain number of files. Let's say we're rendering out doing a Targa sequence or a TIFF sequence that might be imported elsewhere. You can tell it that the sequence will actually break itself into separate folders when that folder reaches a specific number of file contents. Certain operating systems don't like it if you have too many files in there, so you might want to specify, let's bring that down to maybe just 400 files effectively in one folder. Then After Effects will create a new one and throw the rest in there for you. The same for segment movie files. If you're rendering out a QuickTime movie, let's say I'm going to put all these onto a backup of a CD later in time. Instead of rendering out to a very large finished movie, I could say let's default those down to about 640 megabytes per QuickTime, then they can easily be backed up. Again, After Effects will render up to that point, cut it, save it, and then render out another one afterwards from that continuing point. You can specify a minimum disk space before overflow actually happens, which obviously relates to when it switches from the first to the second and third drive when it's doing overflow. So the drive could get up to a point where it has only 3 megabytes left, and then will overflow. If you want to leave yourself a bit of room or space, just specify a higher amount there. And that's pretty much the most important settings in there that we need to bear in mind. Okay, if we go and hit next again, we'd get onto the grids and guides options, which are very straightforward options to allow us to customize the type of grids, guides, and proportional grids that we see in our document. We can go through that in detail later when we're starting to lay out items using sort of more design-based techniques. Another option that's worth pointing out here are the safe margins, which you see around the outside of your file when you hit the title safe item in the comp window. And we can see that the defaults are set to 10 and 20%. There may be variations of that around the world with different video formats, so this is where you would specify just that. Again, let's go click next. The label colors that come up refer to the type of label colors you see when your footage is being stacked inside the timeline. So the type of footage you have has a different color reference applied to it. This is where you choose all the colors that will reflect each of those options, and if we hit next, you can actually choose which label is applied to which item in the timeline. So these two, previous and next, do work in tandem. So you'll see that by default, video is set to show up yellow in the timeline. If we wanted to, we could hit previous and go in and adjust that yellow to a different shade or a different color. So again, this is more personal customization of After Effects for your required needs. So I'm going to skip past label defaults and come into the cache options, and you see we have 2 of these. We have basically image cache, which is when you're doing RAM previews, how much RAM is allocated to the RAM preview requirements. At the moment, we have 60% of what's available on this machine, which is equal to around 614 megabytes. And then we have the maximum memory usage, how much After Effects can really use from your system. By default, that's set to 120%, so there's a fair amount of memory set aside here. If you do wish to adjust these, do make sure you have the right amounts of RAM required and don't set the image cache too high because you will cut down on memory requirements for other parts of the program. If again we hit next, we get to the final option, which is video preview. After Effects does allow you to view your previews, the RAM previews and desktop previews, through an option such as a Firewire camera. So if you have a Firewire camera connected to this, which is going through to a monitor, you can tell it to view in real time and in real size just exactly what you've done as a RAM preview. So this is where you would choose your settings for the type of video output you have. You can even tell it to obviously output during RAM previews, which obviously depending on the speed of your computer, the Firewire connection, and or the video card that you're using, it's left off as a default purely because it's not assuming everyone has the fastest system. So you might want to test that option out with regards to the speed of your system. What's also quite handy is telling it to do all window updates. So every time you make a specific change in your comp window, such as color adjustment, you get an immediate feedback on your monitor showing you that, because it's going straight through video preview into the TV monitor. So if you're doing very subtle color changes, you want to check everything is great, then every time you do a window change, it will show up inside the preview window. If we hit next again, we go all the way back round to the beginning and we're back where we started. So this should give you a really good idea of which preferences are very important and how they affect the way that you work in After Effects.